Hello, everyone. We are so happy to see you here today. I know we've got a lot of folks that are joining us for a second or a third or a fourth time, and we have a lot of folks who are probably here for the very first time. My name is Patty Robinson. I am the Faculty Director of Civic and Community Engagement at College of the Canyons, and I'm joined by Kimberly Rosenfeld and Jan McConnell, who we've been working together closely with as a team now for, we're going into our second semester with our Civic Dialogue series. And so we're very, very happy to see you here today. We just want to give a shout out, obviously, to 3CSN also, who has just been a tremendous sponsor of this particular event that started last semester as part of a Bringing Theory to Practice grant, looking at developing an intersegmental civic engagement pathway between community colleges in California and the CSU system. And Kimberly and Jan were part of that original grant, as was I, as well as Dominguez Hills and Cal State Northridge. And then we were lucky enough to receive a second Bringing Theory to Practice grant in January to continue our work. And we brought CSU Los Angeles and also Los Angeles City College on board as part of our team as well. And so today, we are going to get started as we continue our discussion of civic learning and democratic engagement, looking at various topics. And the way that the structure of the presentation is set up is that the first hour will be our guest speakers, both of whom I will introduce in just a moment. And we will ask you to mute yourselves, but towards the end, if you have a question, and you can either put it in the chat, or if you feel like you would like to ask the speakers directly, you can please do so by raising your hand. We'll unmute you. And then also the second hour, we will, when I say we, Jan, Kimberly, and I will have a deeper dive into today's presentation by our guest speakers. And so for those of you who would like to stay on, go into a little bit more of a deeper dive and discussion, please do so. That will follow directly after our speakers in their presentation. And so with that, it's my great honor to introduce our two speakers today, both of whom have done a tremendous amount of work in the field of civic learning and democratic engagement. And I'd like to first introduce Dr. Joseph Kahne. He is the Ted and Joe Dutton Presidential Professor for Education Policy and Politics and co-director with Erica Hagen of the Civic Engagement Research Group, or CERG, at the University of California, Riverside. His research focuses on the influence of school practices and digital media on youth, civic, and political development. Currently, this research team is working with Dr. John Rogers, who is also here from UCLA, and is partnering with Chicago, Riverside, and Salinas on district-wide reform efforts that seek to leverage equity and access to democratic education. Dr. Kahne is also engaged in longitudinal studies that examine impact and equity in relation to varied, and there goes my phone, I apologize, varied civic and media literacy learning opportunities and outcomes. Related work focuses on youth voice and on the impact of teachers' attention to students' lived experiences. Professor Kahne was chair of the MacArthur Foundation. Sorry. I am so sorry. And he's not letting up. Related work focuses on youth voice, on the impact of teachers' attention to students' lived experiences. He has also, or was also, chair of the MacArthur Foundation's Youth and Participatory Politics Research Network. He is currently a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship and National Academy of Education Initiative on Civic Reasoning and Discourse, and the Equity in Civics Steering Committee. In addition, we have Dr. John Rogers. Dr. Rogers is professor at UCLA's Graduate School of Education and Information Studies. He is director of UCLA's Institute for Democracy, Education, and Access, and faculty director of Center X, which houses UCLA's Teacher Education Program, Principal Leadership Program, and Professional Development initiatives. Dr. Rogers' studies and relationship among democracy, education, and different forms of inequity or inequality is also a huge component of his work. He also has written widely on democratic participation and community organizing as strategies for advancing educational equity and civic renewal. Since 2016, his research has examined how political division and racial hostility in the age of Trump affects students' well-being and learning. Dr. Rogers is the recipient of the American Educational Research Association's Presidential Citation. He is the co-author of Learning Power, Organizing for Education and Justice, and co-editor of Public Engagement for Public Education, Joining Forces to Revitalize Democracy and Equalize Schools. Dr. Rogers received his PhD in education from Stanford University and his BA in Public Policy and African American Studies from Princeton University. And with that, I would very much like to introduce our two speakers. And again, I apologize for my phone.
Thanks so much, Patty. I appreciate the warm introductions. I think we're going to share our screen with a presentation. Terrific. Thank you, Joe. As Patty was saying, my colleague Joe Kahne and I both study the civic development of young people. Joe's work centers on civic learning in schools and through digital media. My research looks at how democracy is practiced both in schools and in youth organizing groups. I'm going to see if I can chat in a piece that Joe and I just published a couple weeks ago about the role of principals in promoting democracy, just to give you a little sense of some of the work that we've done. Joe and I worked together on a project called LEAD, Leveraging Equity and Access in Democratic Education, and LEAD partners with schools and districts to expand access to quality civic learning. And I'm going to try and build on my success in chatting the first time. Here's the website for LEAD's work, and there's lots of resources there that speak more generally to civic education and some of the work that we're doing. While the focus of all this work is on younger students, we believe it has implications for higher education as well. To state the obvious, many of today's students in California's elementary and secondary schools will one day move on to California community colleges, CSUs, and UCs. The quality of civic learning in K-12 education thus has profound implications for civic education and civic engagement in higher education. In our talk today, Joe and I plan to first share some thoughts on our current moment and the imperative need to revitalize our democracy. Second, we'll invite you to think with us about what powerful civic learning looks like. Third, we'll share some past research about the unequal distribution of quality civic learning opportunities and why this matters. Fourth, we'll present some key findings from a report that we released in middle of November on civic education in California. And finally, we're going to close with some thoughts on how to revitalize democratic education in the state. And we look forward to being in dialogue with you later about civic education at the K-12 level and about how the ideas that we present about K-12 civic education relate to civic education in higher education. Joe, if you wouldn't mind turning to the next slide. So if we needed any reminder, the events of January 6 underscored the vulnerability of our democratic institutions and the precarious state of democratic norms. In the weeks since, many politicians and pundits have spoken about the important role that civic education can play in shoring up our democracy. But there's a challenge here. We live in a deeply divided country. That division and the contentiousness that comes with it poses real challenges to democratic education. Joe, could you take us to the next slide? So over the last few years, we've been studying the extent to which the broader political climate is shaping life in America's high schools. This slide is from a report titled School and Society in the Age of Trump that reports on a nationally representative survey of high school principals. Let me chat the that report in just so you can take a look at it if you're interested. This slide shows that 85% of high school principals across the country reported growing contentiousness in the classroom environment due to the political environment outside of schools. And almost 90% reported hostile exchanges outside of class between students related to this political environment. Joe, one more slide, please. So principals also talked about the ways that the political rhetoric at the national level spilled into their schools. So Aaron Nash, a high school principal in New Jersey, told us that the divisive, hateful climate of the country frequently seeps into schools with a horrific effect. And Todd Phillips, a principal in North Carolina, said that the broader national climate has got everybody all torn up. I'm sure we've all felt that way, but the extent to which it's playing out in our schools is deeply troubling. Joe?
Thanks, John. So I'd like now just to share a little bit of sort of big picture data, which I think puts in context what we're seeing today. And one of the things that I'm sure many of you are aware of, but that the public dialogue and the way the press talks about what's going on in our country sometimes doesn't surface, is that many of the problems and challenges we're facing today are, one, a result of a long-term and somewhat steady decline over the past many decades. And two, that the problems are not located primarily or only within the formal political institutions or within schools, that a lot of these challenges are across multiple institutions. So we see, for example, the trust in the government peaked in 1964 at 77%, but for the last 20 years, it's mostly been below 30%, and it's considerably lower at the moment. Trust in the public schools has also dropped in half, from about 62% in 75 to 31% now. Trust in the medical system has dropped roughly in half, and we see the consequences, right? So if we're thinking about the challenge that COVID has brought to our society, a piece of it is related to our political strife, a piece of it is related to economic inequality, of course, and a piece of it is also related to undermining in general of trust in the medical system that has occurred over the past several decades. None of that is to say that necessarily people should trust more. In other words, our point isn't that people are mistakenly mistrustful. It's not our job to tell people who they should or shouldn't trust. But it is a statement that as a society, as we become less trusting of our major institutions, it's not a surprise that the legitimacy of our democracy and the functioning of our democratic institutions is more precarious. It's also perhaps not a surprise that I can't make my, got it to advance. Along with those declines in trust, we see a corresponding decline, in this case, in the percentage of respondents rating it essential to live in a country that's governed democratically. So this is by the decade of birth. So the survey is from about 2010, but you'll see that folks who were born in the 40s and 50s are far more likely to be expressing the idea that it's essential to live in a country governed democratically than folks born more recently. And the steepness of that decline is quite striking. Similarly, we see a dramatic increase in the percentage of respondents who said having a democratic system is a bad or very bad way to run the country. So, if we're talking about 2011, and again, the data situation is probably worse right now. In 2011, roughly 10 years ago, young people who were 16 to 24, close to 25% of them are agreeing that a democratic system is a bad or very bad way to run the country. And we see that that's a relatively sizable increase from about 17% if we go back to 1995. It's about a 50% increase in the number of people who are agreeing with that statement. This is a measure of support for authoritarianism. And what you see is that support for authoritarianism did increase between 95 and 2000, and then roughly leveled off. What's interesting here is that among upper income respondents in the US, support for authoritarianism has grown dramatically over the past several decades. So again, very conservative. So the problem is more the trend than the moment. And given the trend, we have to really look at fundamentals, we'll argue, and we'll argue that schools are one of the institutions that can offer a more substantial response, which is not to say at all that schools are the only institution that can offer a response, but they are one of them. And the place I'd like to go next is to say that this idea that schools can play a more substantial role is, as many of you know, not a new idea. Indeed, from the founding of schools in the US, there was the rationale that they would help prepare citizens for democracy. And if we take a look at the California Constitution, Article 9, which is the section of the Constitution that focuses on education, we see that the very first sentence of that article is a general diffusion of knowledge and intelligence being essential to the preservation of the rights and liberties of the people. So right from the start of the California Constitution, we see a strong belief that there's an important role for educational institutions to support the rights and liberty of the people to sustain our democracy. So, having laid that little bit of groundwork, I think where John and I would like to go would now be to talk a little bit about what do we mean, what could civic education look like? And in order to investigate that, I want to share a video of practice. As you're looking at this video of practice, just because we're going to give a little bit of opportunity to put some thoughts in the chat later, I'll highlight two things I'd love you to be thinking about. What do you see that should say feels like a key pedagogical or curricular feature? So what are you seeing in this video that seems important in terms of pedagogy and curriculum? And second, are there parallels and differences between what we're going to look at in this video, which is from ninth grade classroom, and what is going on in higher education, or what is possible in higher education? And I should say, to be clear, that our examples and our report is about K-12 education, but of course, we recognize that a big piece of what we're thinking about are the implications for higher education. I'm hoping, so please let me know if this isn't playing through or coming through clearly, but I'd like to show you a clip about 9 minutes long, so you'll get a real sense of what classroom practice looks like when we're talking about educating for democracy. This comes from a ninth grade high school in Oakland.
We talk a lot about how we don't learn things just for ourselves. We don't learn things just so that we have that knowledge and it's ours to have. But that knowledge is always in service of making your community, our society, a better place. Okay, so let's try to capture that as well. So the purpose of today's class is for you to think about the variety of ways that your contemporary problem manifests itself or shows itself or impacts people in their lives. Today's lesson is embedded in a unit called the future. That unit is really the culmination of a lot of things that we've been working on this year. from small group discussion skills and problem analysis skills. And more recently, we did 3 case studies about social justice movements in the 60s and 70s and how they work to make change. What do you guys think the root causes are? Today, students will be working in small groups to try and summarize and synthesize some research they've been doing about a contemporary issue that they're concerned about, and then begin a conversation about how and where they might be able to make change.
It kind of forces the choice to choose the unhealthy food.
I think allowing students to make those choices really engages them the most and really brings in their families and their communities and allows them to share components of themselves that they don't usually get to bring into school environments. Today's lesson started with some individual thinking where students were processing some research that they've been doing over the last week. And they did that through a tree analogy. Imagine this tree as sort of an analogy of your problem. So the trunk of the tree symbolizes the contemporary problem they've been researching. The leaves are a representation of the variety of ways the problem is manifested in society. And then the roots are about the root causes and what's driving it. If I was in a group on the United Farm Workers and the contemporary problem we identified was bad treatment of workers, I might say like missing wages would be an example of this. And I would go on and on and on looking at my contemporary research notes and using that to think about, okay, what did I learn? What are examples, statistics, ways in which this problem grows out into society? I want everybody to start individually, go through your own notes, and try and get at least one bullet point for the trees and one bullet point for the roots. What are examples of police brutality? Oh, what are ways that gets manifested in society? How do we actually see it in society?
About to give a name, like one of the victims that died.
Yeah, you could. That's absolutely.
Michael Brown.
Mm-hmm. Right. So right, Michael Brown.
Right.
I don't really feel like it works like a tree. Like it's kind of just like.
So think about it like a cause and effect chain. What are some of the effects of obesity?
Like what it's like.
What negative things does it do? Like why?
Well, because there's not healthy food that's like affordable,
Mm-hmm.
it leads to obesity. I kind of feel like obesity is like the end point. All these things are like there's a lot of things perpetuating it.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't really feel like it works like this. Can I
Nice.
use on the back?
Sure. Yeah, go for it.
Is it okay for root is also
Mhm.
because it kind of generates more.
Sadia just brought up a really great point that I want to share with everybody as you're thinking about this. You could have something be both a root and a leaf. So they did some individual brainstorming and then they shared out in their small groups and put their thinking together to create a group poster. Don't worry about this is not an art project. Just draw a rough outline of the tree.
Don't make it look like this.
Right, yes, better than that one, but don't worry about it being quote unquote perfect. Okay. Be also thinking about the discussion strategies that we've been practicing all throughout the year. So starting an idea, adding on, disagreeing, asking questions, and citing for evidence. But I do need at least one person in the group jotting down the context of your discussion.
Blaming the victim is like, I would say both too. Yeah.
The farm bill could be a root cause. I said black targets and racial bias.
The vocab word. The one where it's like a hegemonic narrative. Yeah. Less trust, not trusting because you're black.
Syed, I see something very interesting on your notes that's not on the group diagram yet. So what's this about?
This is 95% of cases in court. Please don't get charged.
So I really wanted students to be able to identify and understand the variety of ways that a problem manifests itself in society and to be able to pinpoint what are the specific causes and what are the effects. And if they can do that carefully and thoughtfully, I think they'll have a more powerful and more intentional action step. So you initially said root cause. Why do you think it's a root cause?
Now, okay, when like the police know they're not gonna get charged, so they're gonna keep doing it. And
Okay. And Trey, you were pointing up here. Why do you also think it's a manifestation? I think my role in the civic engagement work as a whole is really just opening the door and sort of setting a frame, creating a space for them to have the conversation and to apply everything that they have been researching and everything that they know. So what other problems are kind of feeding this that make a law like this necessary in the first place?
No allies, no acceptance, no open mind, bullying, no education on the LGBT community.
It's like there's a lot of pressure for Asians to do well.
So like there's pressure in school, like my teachers. Okay, so
You know, just like that can sum up like all the pressure ones.
so pressure to succeed.
Yeah, pressure from community to succeed.
Yeah.
I think success could look like consensus and agreement of everybody sharing, be like, yeah, I found that too in my research.
So there's so many things like that like lead to obesity.
And it could also look like disagreement.
You need to remember it's not just obesity, it's general people being unhealthy.
And I think them sort of sorting through and hashing through those ideas and seeing the complexity of thought on their trees. I think their trees were a little messy by the end, and I think that is success.
That is what we should strive for at our health education.
So the group focusing on food access, I think, had a very spirited conversation, and I think that their problem is really starting to unravel. And so trying to figure out where to best take action on that, I think, is a big challenge.
Like we can try to do what we can. So when you're saying education, are you talking about educating the people providing the food or educating the students? Because I don't think that I think both. I think both. Yeah, I don't think that students, regardless of whether or not they know that this is the wrong choice, that it's not actually that much of a choice. No, but it becomes a choice when you become knowledgeable and they have access. There's access. That's what I'm saying. Like if we educate them and we're setting it up to like provide them, then I think that they will make a difference.
We should put like cameras on the cops, like cameras
On their vest.
Right.
And that's effective because anytime you can just cover it up.
No, like it's a part of the
If it
job.
gets covered up.
I mean, it would just lead in a higher percent of less killings.
By the end of class, they had started thinking about where and how might we start trimming this tree. And so the metaphor there is like, where can we start addressing this problem? Maybe we can't tackle the whole problem, but there's a smaller part that we can work towards changing. Where and how might we start cutting this tree? The how question is one of tactics.
We can first start by going and talking to our mayor.
Right, you gotta start it in your neighborhood.
Petition. I think it's good. So the next steps are continuing to think more specifically about where they can take action in terms of the tree and what tactic they might use. And then they'll finalize that into a proposal, which they'll then share out with the class. They'll revise their action plan and then work towards implementation. What kind of tactics do you guys think you could implement in order to, say, get the cops to carry cameras and recording equipment?
I feel like a petition will look nice to see like what the community thinks.
And you, Tony, I think we're also suggesting something different of like gaining allies, of reaching out to existing organizations like Black Lives Matter, and we know that they have an Oakland connection. That's also an action step.
I think what first you should do is like you should like inform them about it.
So this lesson and the civic engagement work in general, to me, really gets at the core of what is the purpose of school. I think the purpose of school is to help students learn how to understand themselves better, understand their communities, and be able to work in groups to make positive change in their society.
Hey, everybody. So I hope you enjoyed that. I've watched it numerous times, and I always find the video engaging. I think before we go back to the PowerPoint, though, I would love to just pull up, give folks an opportunity to maybe highlight their thoughts in relation to what we saw connected to those two questions that I had mentioned before. So the first one that I would love for people to just put in the chat if they have thoughts related to it would be, what did you see there from a sort of pedagogical or curricular stance that seemed important? And this doesn't, it could be tied to the realities of the 9th grade, but it also could be a more general comment about what kinds of things you saw going on either in that specific class or in the unit that that class was a part of, because I think when we watch the video, we can sort of see that there was a whole lot that built up to that. And I'll also throw out one more fact that I think is important in relation to this. At this point within Oakland Unified, all 9th graders must do a taking action project. So there's been an effort to systematize not the exact pedagogy and curriculum that this particular teacher, Matt Crowley, used, but this general idea of doing a major action project as a goal. So I'd love for folks to just share their thoughts in the chat and to read through what others are saying.
Joe, if I might just
Please.
pick up on something I think Susan Nold said, that there's a sense in which that there's a public purpose to the exploration that the young people are engaged in, that it's about who we are together. It's about our social concerns, our collective interests.
Yeah, I appreciate you highlighting that and Susan highlighting it, because I think it speaks to, in many respects, what is unique and important about the focus of this seminar series and of the democratic education agenda. There are many ways, of course, that the democratic education agenda is trying to emphasize skills that will be helpful in the workplace and ways to make learning more real and fun. And there are lots of ways to do that. But the piece that is, I think, uniquely important about this is the recognition of the public significance of the work and of the fact that we learn both for ourselves, but we also learn so that we are better positioned to make society a better place. And I think this teacher is really, I mean, he's a remarkable young teacher in his ability both to conceptualize it, but to really implement it with a fabulous group of students. Now I'd like to shift gears for a moment. I'm curious if the things you're seeing here, and this can be, of course, a thing that we talk about after the talk as well, but if the things you saw there, what was it that felt like, yeah, this would work in my setting as well? What elements of this made sense in my setting, and where were there things that felt different? What are both the possibilities, but also potentially some challenges or some differing opportunities in relation to these approaches in a higher education setting, be it a CSU, a UC, or a community? Yeah, I think the large class thing that folks are mentioning, certainly, my undergrad course had 180 students this fall. One has to rethink how you can still do things that have a public purpose, but you have to think differently about how you would structure them. Flipped classroom. Yeah, the real world collaboration. Well, this would be stuff we would love to continue to explore as we move forward. I think I'll jump, if it's okay, back into the presentation so that we can wrap up and get to questions. I'm gonna apologize. I'm going to quickly move through a couple of the research findings, but I really don't want to spend too much time on them because I do want to leave a little bit of time for conversation. We've done a bunch of studies in California to try to understand the degree to which civic learning opportunities do impact student outcomes and the degree to which they're equitably distributed. The good news is that our evidence is that civic learning opportunities can help. These findings come from a very diverse set of 7 districts in California. And we found that when teachers provided opportunities for information and discussion of controversial issues and societal issues, we saw gains in political interest in diverse views, intention to vote, and commitment to community participation. And we found that an experience-based model where young people, for example, did service learning projects or action projects affected a slightly different set of outcomes. Their engagement later on in voluntary activity, their engagement in political action, and their civic skills. The less positive news, we also found that media literacy education helped, that when teachers said that they had at least 3 class sessions focused on media literacy, they were 26% more likely to correctly distinguish an accurate and an inaccurate Facebook posts. Here's the bad news. 34% of the young people in 19 different districts in California said they never did service learning in high school. 36% said they never did a simulation, and 68% said they learned a lot about the structure and function of government. And what's concerning there is this survey was given during their senior year in high school. Government is a required course. We also found that there was a very strong relationship to socioeconomic status, where young people in classrooms that were high on the SES measure were twice as likely to discuss how laws were made, roughly twice as likely to participate in service activities, and about 1.5 times as likely to take part in a panel discussion or debate. Let me turn it over now. So just to underscore, I don't want to move too quickly. One thing we have to be careful about, obviously, are questions of equity with respect to supporting young people's civic and political engagement. I'm hopeful that public schools will do better at narrowing these inequities, but clearly if they don't, it's crucial that institutions like the CSUs and the community colleges and the UCs do narrow those inequities. And we know that there is great inequity in terms of political participation. Let me turn it over to John to say a little bit about our report before we go to questions.
I just put into the chat a link to this report that we released in the middle of November, Reclaiming the Democratic Purpose of California's Public Schools. Recall that earlier in this presentation, Joe shared the first sentence of Article 9 of the state's Constitution, which is lifted up here, that education is essential to the preservation of the rights and liberties. So California clearly, at least on a rhetorical level, marks out democratic education as being critically important. We wanted to see to what extent were districts actually foregrounding these democratic goals, and to what extent were they investing in them? And so, Joe, if you can take us to the next slide. We did a couple different things in this study. One is that we identified 47 districts that were representative of the state as a whole in terms of their demographics. And for each of those districts, we examined on their websites their mission statement to see to what extent it addressed democratic goals. And we also examined the sorts of personnel that they had at the district level to see whether or not they were engaging in civic education. And then we looked at the local control accountability plans of the 1,050 districts across California. Local control accountability plans are the plans that each district has to create that lay out what their goals are and how they're going to invest resources relative to those goals. And then we also conducted a set of interviews with either district leaders or county leaders around the state to determine how and in what ways they were supporting democratic education. Joe, can you take me to the next slide? So from our examination of the district websites and the district mission statements, we saw that about 40% of districts in the state say nothing at all about civics or democratic goals in their mission statements. Another 40%, 44% say something, but what they say about civic education is so thin that you really can't make sense of it. So only about 15% of districts in the state, and hence only about 1 million of California's 6 million students, attend districts where the district's mission statement says something substantial about democratic goals in its mission statement. Joe, next one. So then we looked at these local control accountability plans across all 1,050 districts in the state. And we had a very low bar here. We were just looking to see whether the plans, which often ran 50 pages or so, included words like civics, citizens, citizenship, or democracy. And it was very rare that this happened. So only 9% of districts ever used the word civics. In some cases, it was because they referenced the local civic center where they had an activity. So it had nothing to do with democratic education. And less than 1% of the districts in the state used the word democracy. So you can see that these terms were not used frequently across all districts. Next one, Joe. And then we also saw that it was far less likely that districts had personnel at the district level that were working in social sciences and history than they did in English language arts and science and math. And in many cases, districts had multiple different people at the district level supporting teachers in English language arts and science and math, and either no or only one person in the social sciences. And clearly civics can be addressed through these other subject areas. But if you don't have someone at the district level thinking about social sciences, it often is the case that you're not going to have a robust engagement around civic education. So Joe, if you can take me to the next slide. One cause for hope in this moment is a new piece of a new rule that was enacted by the State Board of Education in September of 2020 called the State Seal of Civic Engagement. This was originally articulated by the state legislature asking for the California Department of Education and the state board to work on, and then it was finally passed by the state board in September. The State Seal of Civic Engagement is literally a seal that will be affixed onto a high school graduate's diploma if they are able to demonstrate high levels of performance and engagement relative to civic engagement. So each district in the state will develop its own criteria based on a set of broad notions that the state board has laid out. This state seal offers a real opportunity for districts to set a set of policies and an agenda moving forward for how to frame robust support in civic education. So we're hopeful about that. And then finally, as we move forward, in our report, we talk about a few different possibilities for state level action. For example, I had referenced before this local control accountability plan process. And one of the ideas that we've put forward is that the state could designate democratic priorities as one of the areas that districts have to speak to. We've talked about the idea of creating indicators on the state's new dashboard so that as districts are thinking about what their outcomes are, they're encouraged to include ideas about civic development. We've talked about a state clearinghouse for all the new ideas that are emerging as they develop the seal of civic engagement. And then our final idea, which we think is particularly compelling, is for the state to establish a master plan that could run, and here's how it connects to our discussion today, could run K-16 in thinking about how the democratic goals of education are being enacted in all institutions that receive public support from the state. And with that, I think we are going to close and open up for discussion.
So we'd love to have your questions if you'd like to put them in the chat. Certainly, if you'd be more comfortable asking our speakers in person or verbally with unmute or by unmuting yourself, please just raise your hand so that way we'll be watching that. I just want to say, as someone who's been so involved and just so sort of overcome with all of this for about 5 years and trying to read as much as I can with the literature. When I read your report that came out in November, I thought, oh my gosh, they've hit the nail on the head. And I especially, this whole point of bringing community colleges into this work, I think is so incredibly important, because what we're seeing is that certainly we can't just look at this as being a community college effort, or certainly leaving it to the CSUs or the UCs, but this has to be something that starts in K through 12. And certainly we know, those of us who teach at the community college, that K through 12, particularly in our local districts, those are the students that come to our community colleges. And so we have this incredible opportunity to foster this kind of pathway that I think, we just really have to bring people to the table and start talking about this. And it can't just be done in silos, and it can't just be done, in one college over here and one college over there. So I just want to say thank you for all these things that you've presented. And I see we're getting a lot of comments here. So let me see here. And Jan and Kimberly, please hop on board here for
I see a question from Jeff Scherer. Have you done research about the teacher training related to this issue? And how are, or not, teacher education programs preparing teachers with the skills to teach this?
John, do you want to, did you do a good bit with this?
So I'll answer indirectly, and then maybe Joe will answer more directly. Jeff, one of the insights that comes from a previous national survey we did with teachers was that the single strongest predictor of whether or not high school teachers were engaging students in discussion about social and political life was whether or not they themselves were socially and politically engaged. So if teachers followed the news regularly, if they talked to friends and family about the news, if they talked to colleagues, and if they participated in some effort to improve their community, they were far more likely than other educators to have discussions about social and political life. Now, clearly, it's also important that teachers have strong subject matter knowledge, have pedagogic knowledge in how to address these issues. But I think this finding speaks to the ways that we want to think about educators' development in relationship to their identity, right? We want people to be civic agents because that's the best way we can think about them engaging young people in ways where those young people too want to be civic agents.
I love that. I've thought about faculty identity for a long time, and having what we might do, excuse me, to help expand our identity, to be concerned with more than our subject matter. I mean, I think we've made great progress in turning things around and being more student focused, right? But now it's more community. We want to bring that in. So I really love you saying that.
And we have a hand up from Felicia. Hello, Felicia. You want to just kind of unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rosenfeld, and thank you, Dr. Rogers and Dr. Kahn. It's nice to see you, Dr. Rogers. And I apologize if I break up, I'm outside. But I had a question. The research is really, really helpful to piece together an image of what civic education is like in California. And I appreciate the video as well that demonstrated so much engagement at the classroom level. And one of the questions that I've had that I'm hoping you could elaborate on, which some of the statistics kind of pointed to, was this also difference in creating pathways and spaces for students to actually become involved in political institutions beyond voting. And so I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on, in your findings and your research, some thoughts on this, because I think that first, as a high school teacher for 4 or 5 years, I found it really exciting to engage students in these issues and topics and to help them develop their literacy about the issues. And where I found myself falling short as a teacher was helping students take that into actually a policy area where they could also enact those, bring that perspective into policymaking spaces. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on this distinction between sort of community engagement, civic education, and these other pathways for institutional, like entrance ways into institutional systems in California.
Maybe I'll jump in first, and then John, if you want to. Thank you for that question, Felicia. I think it's a really important one, and it's really important, I think, to be recognized in the diverse ways in which people can get involved. So one thing we do know from the research is that voting is a very different dimension of political engagement than pretty much everything else. So the factors that drive voting are related to these other factors, but they're different. I mean, for example, being in a community with a close election promotes voting. That's not necessarily what promotes forms of civic engagement, more generally. By and large, what we find from the research is that the closer what you do in school is to what you would like kids to do, the more likely it is to move the needle on that thing. So, for example, if you do a service learning project focused on the environment, you're much more likely to boost young people's engagement in service related to the environment than you are, for example, in service related to criminal justice issues. Kids learn what you teach, and they go along those pathways. So if you want to promote interest in political issues, having discussions of political issues that kids find interesting promotes that. It promotes following the news. But having discussions of political issues doesn't promote service. If you want kids to get involved in thinking about issues of inequality and injustice in society, then giving them concrete opportunities to get involved working on those issues makes a big difference. So, I mean, I think on one level it's obvious, but I think for many of us who think about this at a more abstract level, we imagine, well, we'll discuss the issue in class and then kids will get involved in their community focused on the issue. And for many kids, what you really need to do is to build, for young people and for adults as well, you need to build the structures that allow them to see how they could get involved if you want to really boost their involvement.
We have another question here, and I know we're running out of time, but I do want to at least get this in from Harry Voigt. Is there a conversation in California about connecting careers and career pathways with civic learning and citizenship?
I think the short answer is yes, and I saw Harry's earlier comment too, which I think is really useful about how in the 1930s you see this division between the service piece and the kind of political collective action piece. I think that there are schools in California in the so-called linked learning reform that have created project-based learning opportunities for young people to engage in participatory action research, where they're developing academic skills, identifying civically important topics, and then addressing them sometimes in partnership with community-based organizations. One of the challenges of this in K-12, much like a challenge that's faced in community colleges, is time and the teacher resources to be able to provide this sustained support. This doesn't come cheap. We need to have small enough classes that we can really coach students, support them, create meaningful opportunities for them to be in relationship with community partners. That just takes a lot of planning and time that exists in some other states. But in California, given our K-12 funding, has been less commonly practiced.
And I know we're a couple minutes over here, and I just want to go ahead and respect everyone's time. I want to say thank you so very much to Dr. Rogers and Dr. Kahn for taking the time today to be with us. This was a wonderful presentation. I also want to thank, I see quite a few folks, former participants or speakers, and I also see some future speakers. And I know that Dr. Harry Boyd is on our Zoom today, and Dr. Boyd is going to be our speaker next week. I also see Dr. Flores, I see Dr. McTighe Musil, and I think Dr. Stitzling is also on here. So we want to just say thank you so much to all of you for participating, for being here. And again, next week, we will be holding our third session of our series. And so we hope to see all of you there. And for those of you who want to continue with our dialogue, again, just go ahead and stay on. Kimberly, Jan, and I are going to be leading that discussion in just a few minutes. So again, thank you very, very much to our speakers today. We greatly appreciate you taking the time to meet with us.
I know we just want to say thank you. This was a real treat. So.
Thank you.
Okay, those of you who'd like to stay on, I'm going to put a link in the chat, and this will be an area where you can sign in, and I'll screen share in a moment to kind of walk you through it. So you can open that link in the chat. And let me just screen share for a minute. That was a great talk with so many resources. It was really amazing. So if you scroll down here, you can start to sign in, your first name, your campus role, and maybe if you can share a comment, anything that stood out to you or got you thinking about the talk that we just heard, or a concern or a question, you're going to just put it on there to help guide the conversation we get into our groups. So just for those of you who are new to us, I just want to share our guiding framework for today's session and the agenda, and I'll get us to the point where we're in breakout rooms, and I'll be turning this over to Jan Connell afterwards. So our guiding framework is to advance understanding of the intersection between equity and civic engagement to promote the public good, to recognize civic, community, and democratic engagement as a high impact practice for student success, and to leverage participants' current knowledge, so all of your current knowledge, to build capacity to innovate for local and global change. So what we're going to do is you can, if you're all signed in, you can start to look at folks' comments, but we're going to put you in a breakout room. And once you're in there, you're going to click on this link. And this link, I'm not going to click on it yet, will take you to a collaborative PowerPoint that's assigned to each breakout room that we're going to use as a note-taking PowerPoint slide, just one slide. You can put images in there. You can just put some takeaways that you want to share with the larger group when you come back, because we will have some time for all of you to talk and share out. And your prompt is here. It's also listed on your slide, but you're going to share reflections on the previous hour's talk. So you get into your room, you just talk about these things that you've been filling out here. Okay, so this is a moment while I'm talking to maybe collect your thoughts for a moment about what was shared today. Then discuss the implication this has for the work you do on your current campus or the work you want to do. Any immediate actions you can take. So we really want to make this, again, action oriented on your part. Like, is there anything you can actually leave today and try to implement and do? And then when you return, we do want you to just highlight a spokesperson that will just say a few words about, summarizing your conversation. So before I move to show you that PowerPoint slide, are there any questions?
Kimberly, I don't have a question, but I just thought of an additional thing that might be interesting to talk about when they're in their breakout rooms.
Oh, great. Go ahead.
And that is, if they have an idea, what do they need? What are their immediate needs to be able to implement that idea? Is it training? What could we do to help for the good of the cause? Right? So it's sort of, I see these breakout rooms as knowledge generation, right? And so we can take that and, put our thinking caps on to see what are our next steps as a group.
Great. Thank you so much, Jan. That's perfect. So when you click on this link, once you're in your room, oh, that's weird. It opened in a, I haven't seen that before. Hold on. That's supposed to open in a new window. Hold on, let me try that again. I think I got a little buggy.
You just have to do the drop down.
Oh. Okay, I think I was rushing it. So here are the instructions that I just went through verbally, but they're there for your reference. And then if this, I think I've got a little bit of a slow system here. It's slowly loading. But what you'll see is just each slide has a room number on it. Now it's catching up and a place for you to add your comments. So we're going to put you in rooms, probably give you about 20, what do you say, 20 minutes, Jan and Patty, to let everyone chat. And you'll probably want to do a quick introductions. And while I'm doing that, again, just kind of get your thoughts together, and we'll come back as a group in 20 minutes to talk about this and share.